Every man has his own mindset and own power to choose his own destiny. And yes, I did ask for the chair, and the reason that I asked for the chair is because it's pretty much an instant death. Many speculate that the reason I had asked for the chair was to prolong my execution, and that's false. I know that I'm guilty. And what's the point in having capital punishment if it's not going to be used in a proper manner? You don't lock human beings up in a cell. They're not animals. You just don't do it, and you can't expect that individual to be a human being after putting them in that cell forever. Yeah, it just don't work that way. It makes a person even worse than what they were when they went in there. I was born in Pueblo, Colorado, April 12, 1973. My father was an alcoholic. He was always out drinking or out running around with his friends. He was very physically abusive towards all my stepmothers. I remember one time very clearly, he had beaten Shelley so bad that she looked like something that had stepped out of the ring with Mike Tyson. Half of her hair was yanked out of her head. Both her eyes were swollen shut. Her nose was busted. Her mouth was busted. Had we have kept any guns in the house or whatever, which my father never did, I'd have killed my father. And I should have done that a long time ago. From that point forward, my run-ins with the law just escalated. I started running away from home, started stealing checks from my dad, started stealing money from my dad, trying to get out of that, desperately trying to get out of that environment. And then finally, when I was like 15, 16 years old, I left his house. I said, I couldn't take it anymore. I'm at the age now I can leave your house. My grandfather used to tell me all the time, son, you need to not hold things in your head, because you hold things in, it's going to build up and things are going to explode and you're going to wind up in trouble, serious trouble. And that's what wound up happening. I started drinking more and became more agitated, more aggravated. And Harvey Horn was my foreman. He was also a middleman in crystal meth. So I go over there and do meth every now and then. I was over at his house one night. Now, I went over there with a pistol, but I didn't intend on robbing him or doing anything to him. I brought that gun over there for a trade out for drugs. When I showed up over there, we had both been up for about a week straight on crystal meth. An argument ensued. When he got up out of his chair, I knew right then and there that we were either gonna have a hell of a fight on our hands, or I was gonna have to kill him right away, or at least hurt him. And hell, if I'm gonna shoot him, why not kill him? And I was able to push him back off me. And when I pushed him back off me, I pulled the revolver up and I shot him point blank in the face. I didn't know whether he was dead or not. So I said, well, I can't just leave a man half dying in his house. And I unloaded the gun 5 times in his face. Did he deserve to die? Probably not. But he's dead and I can't bring him back. The state was seeking the death penalty. But due to I didn't have any severe prior histories, they dropped the death penalty and wound up sentencing me to life in prison without possibility of parole. I got a high expectation for respect. I give respect, I want the same thing back, no matter whether you're an inmate, no matter whether you're an officer. It doesn't always go that way, especially with inmates. At the time, I was selling tobacco, which we're not allowed to have, so it's like a black market. Xavier Rodriguez. I initially had thought that he had stole something from me. He was young, he had a slick mouth on him. He called me pussy ass cracker. I told him, we're gonna put handcuffs on you, which was made out of sheets, and if you can get out of them, I'll give you a pack of rip, and a pack of rip is like $100 in this place back then. So he agreed to do it. And then I walked up behind him and I put him in a sleeper hold to make him pass out. I know that once you cut the blood circulation off to the brain, within minutes they're going to die because your brain is without blood oxygen. About 15 seconds, he had pissed all over himself. I could see the urine on the floor. And I stabbed him approximately 25 times within his abdominal area and upper area. After he was killed, I smoked a cigarette, took a shower afterwards, and went down to the quarterdeck and said, "Hey man, you got a dead body upstairs." It was very calculated to be in a maximum security facility, and to be able to accomplish that was pretty good. There's no questionable doubt about my guilt in this case. I see no sense in trying to beat myself up mentally and sitting back and fabricating a fantasy that I'm not guilty when I know I am.
I'm Mary Cole. I'm Wayne Charles Doty's mom. This is Randy. He just recently got out of the Army. We dated for a while, and I got pregnant, and we had Wayne. He weighed 6 pounds, 12 ounces, I believe, and he was curly hair, blonde, blue eyes. Looked just like his father, right there. His father's blonde, blue eyes. He liked his freedom, Randy did. You know, he used to be the kind of husband that would go and don't come back. One day, Randy and I had gotten in an argument, and I went to the grocery store. And when I came back, Wayne and Randy were gone. I called the police. I told him that my son was gone, and the dad took the baby. And they said, well, were you separated? And I said, no, we weren't. And they said, well, Randy has as, you know, the father has as much right to the child as you do. And I just thought maybe he would show up sooner or later, and he never did. Never brought Wayne back or didn't let me know anything. Wayne told me that Randy had told him that I was dead. He went into his grandmother's barn in Michigan and found pictures of myself, which he didn't know who that was, asked his grandma who that was. And she told him, that's your mother. The next time I seen him, he was a lot older, 20, 21 years old. Wayne called and wanted to come to Denver and meet with his brothers and his sister. And we flew him out here, and he was here approximately 3 months, the most. When he was here, he probably felt out of place, like, do I really belong here or don't I belong here? He got a job. He bought himself a car. He used to like to go camping, so he had friends, and they would leave on Friday night and come back on Sunday. We came home, no Wayne's car outside, no nothing, so I thought, well, that kid is out again tonight. The next day, Nothing. And his boss that he was working for, his employer, called and told me that he's gone. He left. He quit. And he's going back to Florida. His father needed him there. I don't understand why he up and left the way he did. Did Randy have that much power over him, or, or did Randy make him feel guilty as to he needed to go back there? I didn't hear anything for a while, and then Randy called me and said, "Mary?" And I said, "Yes." And the voice, that Floridan accent, "Mary?" "Yes." "This is Randy." "Well, no shit. What do you want?" "Well, Wayne's really done it now." "What did he do?" "Well, he just shot some guy in the face 5 times.
Wayne Doty killed my father, murdered him in cold blood, shot him in the face. My father's name was Harvey Eugene Horn II. My name's Harvey Eugene Horn III. We spent many a Sunday morning fishing out on the water, spending just father and son time, basically. We have a lot of great days on the lake fishing. Most of my earliest memories was going fishing, and most of my earliest happy memories were fishing with my father. Me and my father were very close. I was the only child, no brothers, no sisters, so I got all the attention. All the love and caring and everything that I guess you could spread on one person. He gave it to me all. He had a great sense of humor, all in fun, not vicious or anything, but just a great guy, just fun guy to be around. Right before my 21st birthday, I was at work and some officers came to my work. Then they told me the bad news, and the most horrible news I ever received in my whole entire life, that my father had been murdered, been shot to death. Of course, I mourned the loss of him, and in the meanwhile, I did get myself in trouble and did a few things I probably shouldn't have never tried, and a few things I shouldn't have never done. It definitely had an effect on my life, not having someone proud of you, and every son wants to make their father proud of them in one way, shape, or form. I really wish he was still here to be able to cast out a pole with me and enjoy the day, but he's not. So every chance I get, I try to get on the water and do the same thing. I love you, Dad.
He said, "Mama, I'm sorry, but I hope I get the death penalty. I hope you can meet with my wishes." And I told him I did, that he was an adult and he could do make his own choices. But I don't want him to die. Not until God says, okay, Wayne, it's time for you to come, but not of his own choice.
There's no questionable doubt about my guilt in this case. Now, do I have remorse for the victim himself? No, I don't. But I look at the victim's mother, and if I was the one that was murdered, I would want finality brought forth towards my mother if that was me in that situation.
It was good to hear his voice. He says he deserves it, but I'm sorry, but he's saying he deserves to die for taking that life. But when he did it to save himself, his business. That kid tried to take Wayne's business. It's hard to see how Wayne was able to do those things. Sometimes I try and put myself in his position. And I don't believe that that child ever seen real love in his lifetime, except when he was tiny, tiny. And I just believe that Wayne spent so many years in prison that he doesn't know anything else. And what he's learned in prison, living in prison, is either take care of yourself, because nobody else is going to do it for you. But is that the way Wayne wants to die? Is somebody kill him? And then he'd feel better. Okay, now I can see Jesus. No.
He argued against the imposition of the death penalty, but virtually everything he did and presented to that jury would have, in my mind, moved them towards a conclusion that death was the appropriate recommendation. I've had a great deal of direct contact with him. I don't usually get that, certainly not with murder defendants. He's a very interesting character. He's a smart man. He is also extraordinarily frightening in that he will tell you with no emotion that he has killed before, that he might kill again if he thought circumstances made it appropriate. He is motivated by a moral code that is strong and unique to him, even if it would be totally foreign and unacceptable to the rest of us, but it is very much a part of his life. Prior to a couple of years ago, it was perfectly permissible for a jury to recommend a sentence of death by a majority and for the judge then to make a final decision. At the time of Doty's first trial, and that's what happened, a verdict of 10-2 recommended death. The United States Supreme Court changed the rules on death penalties in the states, and in Florida in particular, a couple of years ago in a case called Hearst. Subsequent to the Hearst decision, it must be unanimous. The jury will be told that they are not concerned with whether or not he is guilty. That's already been decided. Their sole decision is what the sentence should be. Nothing has changed since the 2013 trial that would make me think any differently than I did then. The only sentence that I think I can ethically and legally seek is death.
I could use any number of words to use to explain my feelings towards Wayne Doty, but at this point in time, I choose not to because it doesn't do any good. Doesn't bring my father back, doesn't change Wayne's opinion. He wants to make a mockery of our judicial system and decided that, you know, that he needs to be able to fight for his right to be able to die. Well, he didn't want to do that when he killed my father. And after he killed my father, he did everything he could do to fight getting put in prison. Personally, I think he's a murdering coward. Wayne Doty's a murdering coward. Is exactly what he is. And he's in such a coward that he would rather allow the state of Florida to take his life rather than him taking his own life. He wasn't worried about life or living until he decided he didn't like prison. After he'd done spent some time in prison, then Wayne changed his mind, decided that this wasn't so great. So my only way out is to kill myself, but I'm a coward and I can't kill myself. So I'm gonna have somebody else kill me. A lot of people's asked me, you know, would it give you closure if Wayne died in prison? Would it give you closure if he gets the electric chair? Would it give you closure to know that the man that killed your father is dead? There's no such thing as closure. I don't know where people come up with closure, because if you close something, that means it's never open. And that means you forgot about it. And I'll never forget about what a murdering coward did to my father. So me and my thinking and my way of feeling is I'd absolutely love to see Wayne Doty become the oldest living inmate to be still alive in Florida State Prison, to live out his old days when he's old and decrepit and he can't hardly walk and he's suffering and there's no pain medication and there's nothing to ease the pain, no soft bed, no soft, you know, comfort. I'd love to see Wayne suffer for the rest of his life in prison. To die a very old man in prison. That's the best thing that could ever happen to Wayne Doty.
Wayne's a good guy. He's a great person. Very understanding human being. He's very intelligent. He's got a good heart. He's got a heart that's gold. A lot of people would love to have a heart like him. My dad left me before I was born, and then he ended up overdosing off of heroin. You know, my mom wasn't really there for me. The first time I went to prison was in 2003. After about me doing, I'd say, 5 years in prison, that's when I met Wayne through a friend of mine that was he was a good dude, and he said that Wayne was a good person to talk to on a business level. And once we started doing business with each other with like making money with like chewing tobacco or whatever, we started building a friendship, and then it started building into I'd say a relationship like a father and son. And that's why I call him Dad, because he's like a father to me. I ain't never had a dad growing up, so the person that for someone like that, the advice that he's given me has been like what a father would give a son. So it means a lot to me. We ride each other like twice a week. It keeps me sane. It keeps me in line. Y'all want letters from Wayne? Here, come on. Let's go in here. Y'all letters from Wayne right here. Monday, January 18, 2016. Hello, son, where do I begin? First and foremost, know that Dad loves you, and my love is unconditional, son. I think about you more than you probably do me, but that's fine. Do you want to be back in prison? Definitely not. That's where you are headed, son. Do you want to lose your license? One more DUI? And you'll be a habitual offender. Prison time, no license. Forget all that. You damn near died. I love you, and I know damn well you can do better than that, Brett. I mean, look at all the letters. I mean, that's us corresponding. Too much to count. I mean, I might have a letter from him every day. It seems like. He's got my back, and I got his back, and that's when you got somebody. It's better to have one solid friend than 30 fake friends. And when you can really express to somebody, you can trust somebody, and you know they're not going to turn on you, it's priceless. Wayne killed Rodriguez over the tobacco. Wayne was given a big bomb of tobacco, okay, to put on the confinement cart to bring to somebody else. Rodriguez sold the tobacco. That's a lot of money, you know, something's gotta happen. Wayne was put in a situation to where it was either his life or Rodriguez. You know, it wasn't like he just walked by and just shot him or something for no reason, you know, there was a motive, there was a reason behind of what he did, but he was also forced to do it in a way. If he would have had a father and a mother that was supportive of him and was there for him growing up, he wouldn't be in the situation that he's in now. If they execute him, you know, it's going to cause, it would be devastating to me because he's like a father figure to me. You know, he's always given me great advice. I have a different outlook on life now. Gosh, it's a major impact. He's been a major impact on my life, definitely. I said, if you don't fight this, you know you're leaving people behind that love you. Love is unconditional. When you love somebody, you love them no matter what choices they make, no matter what they have done. When you love somebody, that's what it is. And I love him, he's like a dad to me. He's my best friend.
As a standby attorney, I have to be prepared at any moment to step into this case. Wayne, at any time, he could turn to me and say, hey, Kopek, I want you to do this. I think the chances with Wayne are slim, but I have to be prepared for that because, again, at every critical stage, the judge has to again remind him, you have a right to a counsel in this. Do you want to have counsel? It's definitely fair to say that Wayne, from the get-go, as soon as he was sentenced to death, was like, all right, what do I need to do to expedite my death sentence? I would say that I know Wayne very well. Wayne is a hard nut to crack, but I like to think he's come to trust me, not just as his lawyer, but as a friend. Wayne is obviously not educated, but is he smart? Definitely, definitely. A keen intellect and a curiosity. I mean, there is this notion that these guys that are on death row are monsters and they're horrible. And they, you know, there's no question about it. They've done horrible things, but it doesn't define who they are. They are not just that. I wouldn't want to be defined by my worst, the worst thing that I ever did in my life. Wayne has already been found guilty of first-degree murder. So the hearing that's coming up, it's strictly just, is he gonna get life or is he gonna get death? Capital trials are nerve-wracking. Really, all trials, when somebody's liberty is being faced, are nerve-wracking, but capital trials, when you're talking life and death, is intense. Wayne is an honest, sometimes brutally honest to a point person. And even if what Wayne is doing is just putting it forth before the jury and making it their decision, and he's not going to advocate for a certain position, I still hope to God that he shows this jury the goodness that's in him. And of course, my hope is that they see the value in his life and that they spare his life.
Wayne Daugherty's a motoring coward. Is exactly what he is. And He's such a coward that he would rather allow the state of Florida to take his life rather than him taking his own life. I'd love to see Wayne suffer for the rest of his life in prison. To die a very old man in prison. That's the best thing that could ever happen to Wayne Doty.
And I'm sorry he feels that way, him not knowing me as an individual. You know, if he feels that I need to spend the rest of my life in prison, then so be it, you know. His father wasn't a crystal clear individual. Did he deserve to die? Probably not, but he's dead and I can't bring him back. You know, sorry, I don't have the powers to do that.
Wayne killed Rodriguez over the tobacco. You know, it wasn't like he just walked by and just shot him or something for no reason. You know, there was a motive. There was a reason behind of what he did, but he was also forced to do it in a way. Wayne was put in a situation to where it was either his life or Rodriguez.
I can't positively say that Rodriguez was the actual one that stole that tobacco from me. I don't know whether he did it or not. There's no evidence. And I didn't see him with my own eyes take anything from me off the cart that it was supposed to be taken off of. And after sitting back and really thinking it over, who in their right mind would allow their hands to be tied up if they've actually wronged somebody in that direction? We had words before, you know, months prior, to where it started over a simple newspaper. And he, by way of disrespect, called me a pussy-ass cracker. And in prison or anywhere, you know, for somebody to call me that, that's very disrespectful. That doesn't sit with me very well. Why? Because I don't call people that. And I have a high tolerance of respect. If I give respect, I want respect to be given back no matter who you are or what position you're in. You know, I mean, that's just a human nature. But, you know, hey, he's gone now and I can't bring him back, man.
And in your value system, disrespect on that level, calling someone a pussy-ass cracker, is grounds for murder?
It can be. Because if others hear somebody call you that and they see that you let it get by, then you open yourself up and you become prey. It can open up a big door that I just soon not have opened up. I'll shut it as quick as it's opened up. I'm 44 years old, fixing to be 45 years old. I'm older. I'm not a young jitterbug like these young jitterbugs are these days. I can't stand there and go 10, 15 minutes, you know, with a young jitterbug that feels like he wants to get his hands dirty, you know. And the only way to put one of them out of misery is just take him out of misery right away. I know it sounds cold, but it is what it is, man. Does anybody ever have to kill anybody? No, they don't. You know, he definitely wasn't a threat to me. You know, he didn't have to die. No, he didn't, but he did. And I can't bring him back. At the time, it felt like it was the right thing to do with that individual. I'm a violent individual, and that's just the way I am. You know, that's what's been embedded in me since I was a kid. You know, and I'm just who I am. I am guilty for killing another individual. I've accepted that responsibility. I've stepped up to the plate as a human being and accepted. That's a big responsibility. That's a big chunk to accept. You know, I put myself in this position, and now I'm wearing it. If it was up to me, and you know, we go straight from the courthouse to the death chamber. I could finish this conversation talking to you people right now, and walk straight to the execution chamber and get it over with. And look the victim family in the face and tell them, look, I'm sorry. I can't bring your loved one back, but if this is gonna bring you closure, then so be it. Let's move on. You can move on with your life and I'll be resting in a better place. I've done something wrong and I've got to pay the consequences for my actions. I'm a murderer. Normally, in this situation and circumstance, an attorney would normally stand here before you and beg for you to sentence their defendant, their client, to life in prison. And I had a long discussion with my people yesterday. And it's whatever justice you seem necessary. Make sure your decision is based off of evidence, not a personal decision, and based off the law. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
And members of the jury, you now please depart to begin deliberating.
It began with a whisper that no one could hear, not the sound of breaking glass, not the crack of a forced door, just the almost imperceptible movement of someone standing in darkness, waiting, watching, measuring every second between the creak of a floorboard and the breathing of a sleeping family. In the quiet suburbs of California during the mid-1970s, there was a predator who seemed to understand fear better than the people he hunted. He studied routines. He memorized neighborhoods. He learned the habits of ordinary families until he knew their lives almost as well as they did. Then, without warning, he appeared. For years, police believed they were chasing a phantom. Victims described a masked man with extraordinary confidence. Detectives collected evidence, interviewed witnesses, and followed thousands of leads. Yet every investigation ended with the same impossible conclusion. The offender had vanished again. His crimes stretched across counties, crossed jurisdictions, changed patterns, and evolved over time. Different police departments gave him different names because no one realized they were searching for the same man. Decades would pass before science connected the evidence and revealed the identity hidden behind one of America's most notorious serial predators. California in the early 1970s was expanding rapidly. New suburbs spread across Sacramento and the surrounding communities. Families moved into recently built neighborhoods believing they had found safety, opportunity, and stability. Streets were lined with modest homes, children played outside until dusk, and neighbors often left windows open to cool their houses during warm evenings. It was a landscape built on optimism. Few imagined that someone was quietly learning every shortcut, every fence line, every canal, and every dark path connecting those neighborhoods. The first crimes later connected to the offender occurred not as murders but as burglaries. Investigators eventually referred to the unknown suspect responsible as the Visalia ransacker because of a long series of residential break-ins in and around Visalia, California. Between 1974 and 1975, homes were entered in unusual ways. Drawers were disturbed. Personal belongings were moved. Small items disappeared while valuables were often ignored. Detectives noticed behavior that seemed almost irrational. The offender appeared less interested in financial gain than in invading private spaces. He lingered inside homes. He rearranged possessions. He created confusion that left victims questioning whether someone had actually entered their houses or whether they had simply forgotten where they left things. At first, many residents believed the incidents represented ordinary burglary. Police investigated accordingly. Reports accumulated. Fingerprints were collected whenever possible. Neighborhood patrols increased. Yet the burglar continued returning. His confidence appeared to grow. He moved easily through residential areas. He escaped before officers arrived. Witnesses occasionally reported seeing a young man running through neighborhoods or climbing fences, but descriptions varied enough that no clear suspect emerged. Investigators gradually recognized an unsettling pattern. The offender appeared to conduct surveillance before entering homes. He selected targets carefully. He often escaped using routes that suggested extensive familiarity with local geography: canals, open fields, parks, drainage systems, backyards. He transformed ordinary suburban infrastructure into invisible escape corridors. Residents began locking doors more carefully. Neighborhood meetings addressed the burglaries. Parents warned children about strangers. Still, few imagined these crimes represented the beginning of something far more dangerous. On September 11th, Sill, 1975, a confrontation occurred that later became one of the most significant events in the early history of the investigation. Law enforcement officer Claude Snelling confronted a suspect outside his Visalia home after hearing suspicious activity involving his daughter. During the confrontation, Snelling was shot and later died from his injuries. The gunman escaped. At the time, investigators did not definitively connect the shooting to every burglary under investigation, although similarities attracted attention. Years later, many investigators concluded that the Visalia ransacker and the individual responsible for Snelling's murder were the same offender, later identified as Joseph James D'Angelo. The evidence supporting that conclusion developed gradually over decades as investigators connected previously separate cases. The significance of the Visalia crimes would only become fully apparent much later. The offender disappeared from that area. Then another series of crimes began. In June 1976, a young woman in Sacramento County awoke during the night to discover a masked intruder inside her bedroom. He threatened her. He bound her. He sexually assaulted her. Then he disappeared. Investigators treated the attack as an isolated crime. Within weeks, another assault occurred. Then another. Then another. The similarities became impossible to ignore. Victims described a masked man entering homes at night after residents had gone to sleep. He often used shoelaces or cords to bind victims. He demonstrated remarkable control over each crime scene. He appeared calm, organized, prepared. He frequently escaped before police could establish effective perimeter searches. The attacks terrified Sacramento County. Initially, newspapers struggled to describe the unknown offender. Different headlines emphasized different details. The rapist, the prowler, the masked intruder. Eventually, investigators adopted the name that would become infamous throughout California, the East Area Rapist. The title reflected the geographic concentration of the early attacks rather than the offender's full criminal history. At that moment, no one realized his crimes would eventually extend far beyond Sacramento. Detectives assigned to the East Area Rapist investigation immediately recognized they faced an exceptionally disciplined offender. He frequently entered homes through unlocked windows or doors after carefully studying neighborhoods. Investigators believed he sometimes prowled residential areas beforehand, identifying routines and vulnerabilities. Victims later described hearing strange noises outside their homes during nights preceding the attacks. Dogs barked unexpectedly. Objects appeared moved. Unknown footprints appeared near fences or flower beds. Many incidents seemed insignificant until viewed collectively. The offender appeared to rehearse. He tested neighborhoods. He learned escape routes before committing attacks. This preparation repeatedly placed him one step ahead of investigators. Law enforcement agencies dramatically increased patrols. Helicopters searched neighborhoods following attacks. Plainclothes officers monitored residential streets. Community meetings attracted hundreds of frightened residents seeking guidance. Police encouraged homeowners to lock windows, install exterior lighting, trim vegetation near houses, and report suspicious individuals immediately. The public responded. Telephone tip lines received thousands of calls. Every suspicious vehicle, every unfamiliar pedestrian, every prowler reported by nervous homeowners generated investigative activity. Most leads proved unrelated. The offender remained unidentified. The attacks continued. Victims consistently described psychological manipulation extending beyond physical violence. The offender often whispered threats. He appeared intensely focused on maintaining control. Investigators concluded he carefully planned each assault to maximize fear while minimizing opportunities for resistance. Behavioral observations gradually suggested someone familiar with law enforcement procedures. The offender understood response times. He anticipated search tactics. He escaped with remarkable consistency. Some detectives privately wondered whether he possessed military or police training. At that stage, however, no evidence established such a connection. The speculation reflected the extraordinary sophistication displayed during the crimes rather than verified fact. Meanwhile, forensic investigators collected every available piece of evidence: latent fingerprints, footwear impressions, biological evidence, fibers, tool marks, crime scene photographs. Each assault expanded the growing archive documenting one offender's methods. Laboratory capabilities during the mid-1970s remained limited compared with modern standards. DNA profiling did not yet exist. Investigators relied upon blood typing, fingerprints, witness statements, and traditional forensic techniques. Despite their dedication, identifying the offender proved extraordinarily difficult. The East Area rapist adapted continuously. When neighborhoods increased vigilance, he shifted locations. When patrols intensified, he adjusted timing. He appeared to monitor media coverage and police activity closely. Community anxiety reached unprecedented levels. Residents organized neighborhood patrols. Gun sales reportedly increased. Some families slept in shifts. Parents checked locks repeatedly before going to bed. Children sensed growing fear without fully understanding its source. The psychological impact extended far beyond individual victims. Entire communities altered daily routines because one unidentified offender remained free. Investigators from multiple agencies began sharing information more regularly. Jurisdictional boundaries complicated coordination. Each police department maintained separate records. Communication systems lacked the speed available decades later. Still, detectives recognized similarities impossible to dismiss. The offender demonstrated remarkable athletic ability. He often fled on foot. He navigated fences effortlessly. He appeared comfortable moving through darkness. Witnesses occasionally reported hearing him mutter to himself before or during attacks. Some believed he cried. Others described sudden emotional shifts. Behavioral specialists cautioned against drawing broad conclusions from such observations alone. Stress affects perception. Victims experiencing terrifying events may remember details differently. Nevertheless, investigators carefully documented every consistent observation. They understood that patterns sometimes emerge only after numerous cases accumulate. By the end of 1976, California faced an unprecedented criminal investigation. The unknown offender had repeatedly demonstrated his ability to invade occupied homes, terrorize victims, and disappear before capture. Fear spread with every new attack. Police departments expanded investigative resources. Task forces formed. Evidence rooms filled with reports. Maps became covered with colored pins marking crime scenes. Some detectives believed they were gradually closing in. Others feared they were always arriving one step too late. No one yet understood that the crimes would continue evolving, the geographic range would expand dramatically, and the same predator would eventually be linked not only to dozens of sexual assaults, but also to a series of murders committed hundreds of miles away. The nightmare that had begun as mysterious burglaries and nighttime attacks was only entering its earliest chapter, and the man responsible had not yet committed the crimes that would make him one of the most relentlessly pursued serial offenders in American history. By the beginning of 1977, fear had become part of everyday life across large sections of Northern California. Families no longer assumed the locks on their doors would protect them through the night. Bedroom windows that had once remained open during warm evenings were now sealed shut. Hardware stores reported increased sales of deadbolts, floodlights, alarm systems, and large dogs. Neighborhood watch groups multiplied. Police departments held crowded public meetings where frightened residents demanded answers that investigators simply did not have. Every attack followed a pattern familiar enough to spread panic, yet unpredictable enough to frustrate every effort to stop it. The unknown offender seemed capable of appearing anywhere at any time, selecting victims with chilling precision before disappearing into the darkness long before patrol cars reached the scene. Detectives faced an opponent who appeared to study them as carefully as they studied him. Each new assault added another layer to the growing behavioral profile. The offender almost always operated after dark. He frequently entered homes while occupants were asleep. Investigators believed he often spent considerable time watching neighborhoods before acting. Victims occasionally recalled seeing unfamiliar individuals walking through residential areas days before an attack. Others remembered hearing noises outside their homes during previous nights. Some found gates unexpectedly open. Others discovered objects moved around their yards. Viewed separately, these incidents appeared insignificant. Viewed together, they suggested systematic surveillance. The offender seemed to prepare every attack long before entering the house. His patience distinguished him from many other violent offenders. Detectives increasingly believed they were dealing with someone who derived satisfaction not only from the crimes themselves, but also from the process leading up to them. If preparation became part of the offense, observation became part of the offense, control became part of the offense. Crime scene investigators documented another disturbing pattern. The offender frequently manipulated the environment inside the home. He moved furniture. He stacked dishes or small objects on victims' backs or nearby surfaces, apparently intending to hear them fall if anyone attempted to move. He searched rooms with confidence. He demonstrated familiarity with residential layouts. Investigators concluded that he maintained remarkable awareness of his surroundings even under stressful circumstances. Unlike impulsive offenders, he rarely appeared rushed. Instead, he dictated the pace of each encounter. That level of composure suggested extensive planning rather than spontaneous violence. The investigation expanded rapidly. Sacramento County Sheriff's Office detectives worked alongside neighboring agencies as attacks spread into additional jurisdictions. Maps filled with colored markers identifying crime scenes. Investigators compared entry methods, escape routes, witness statements, and physical evidence. The similarities became overwhelming. The same offender was almost certainly responsible. Still, knowing that multiple crimes were connected did not reveal who he was. Thousands of tips continued arriving. Former neighbors, suspicious coworkers, ex-boyfriends, recently discharged military personnel, known burglars, parolees, anonymous callers. Each lead required evaluation. Most ended without meaningful evidence. Meanwhile, the attacks continued. The psychological impact reached extraordinary levels. Residents began sleeping with loaded firearms nearby. Some families installed makeshift alarms using bells or strings attached to doors and windows. Others organized volunteers to patrol neighborhoods throughout the night. Parents warned teenagers not to remain outside after dark. Women altered daily routines. College students changed housing arrangements. Communities that had once welcomed evening walks became noticeably quieter after sunset. The offender had achieved something few criminals accomplish. He transformed ordinary suburban life into an atmosphere of constant anticipation. Every unfamiliar sound became a possible warning. Every barking dog interrupted sleep. Every passing shadow invited suspicion. Detectives also noticed that the offender occasionally telephoned victims before or after attacks. These calls were deeply disturbing. Some contained heavy breathing. Others involved brief statements. Many ended abruptly. Investigators recognized the calls as another expression of psychological domination. The offender appeared determined to extend fear beyond the physical crime itself. Telephone records during the 1970s offered investigators only limited assistance. Tracing calls quickly enough proved extremely difficult. By the time authorities responded, the caller had usually disappeared. Nevertheless, Every reported communication was documented carefully. Behavioral analysts considered the calls part of the offender's broader pattern of exercising control. As the investigation intensified, detectives became increasingly convinced that the offender possessed unusual knowledge of police procedures. He consistently escaped before coordinated searches reached likely exit routes. He avoided leaving obvious evidence. He selected neighborhoods offering multiple avenues of escape. Some investigators theorized that he monitored radio scanners or newspaper reports describing police activity. Others wondered whether he had formal law enforcement or military experience. These remained investigative theories rather than established facts, but the offender's repeated ability to evade capture made such possibilities difficult to ignore. Several near encounters heightened frustration. On more than one occasion, officers responded while the offender was believed to be nearby. Search teams established perimeters. Canine units were deployed. Helicopters searched from above. Yet he vanished. Witnesses occasionally reported seeing someone running through canals, climbing fences, or crossing fields immediately after attacks. By the time officers reached those locations, nothing remained except footprints or fleeting descriptions. Each unsuccessful search reinforced the growing belief that the offender had carefully planned his escape long before committing each crime. Forensic evidence continued accumulating. Investigators recovered fingerprints from some scenes, though not all proved suitable for identification. Footwear impressions suggested athletic movement across uneven terrain. Biological evidence was preserved according to the scientific standards of the time, even though the techniques necessary to extract its full value had not yet been developed. Crime laboratories carefully cataloged every sample. Detectives understood that preserving evidence mattered even when existing technology could not answer every question. That decision would eventually become one of the investigation's greatest strengths. Media coverage intensified throughout California. Newspapers published maps showing attack locations. Television stations interviewed detectives and frightened residents. Journalists documented changing security habits across affected communities. The unknown offender became one of the state's most discussed criminal investigations. With each attack, pressure upon law enforcement increased. Citizens wanted reassurance. Political leaders requested progress reports. Investigators worked extraordinarily long hours reviewing evidence, interviewing witnesses, and coordinating with neighboring agencies. Despite those efforts, the offender remained unidentified. The crimes also revealed another disturbing characteristic. Victim selection appeared increasingly unpredictable. Single women, married couples, different neighborhoods, different ages. The offender adapted continually. Detectives struggled to identify a consistent motive connecting every victim beyond geographic opportunity and careful surveillance. This lack of a simple victim profile complicated prevention efforts. Residents could not easily determine whether they faced elevated risk. Many concluded that anyone living within the affected areas might become a target. By late 1977, investigators had connected dozens of sexual assaults to the same offender. The East Area rapist had become one of California's highest investigative priorities. Task force meetings brought together detectives from multiple jurisdictions. Evidence boards expanded. Investigative files filled entire offices. Every available forensic method was employed. Behavioral specialists analyzed crime scene patterns. Yet every answer generated new questions. Who was this man? How did he choose his victims? Where did he live? How did he disappear so consistently after each attack? The offender seemed to exist only during the crimes themselves. Outside those terrifying hours, he blended invisibly into ordinary California life. Perhaps the most unsettling realization involved his apparent ability to maintain that ordinary existence. Investigators increasingly believed they were searching not for someone living on society's margins, but for an individual capable of appearing completely unremarkable. Someone with employment, a residence, daily routines, neighbors, perhaps even a family. The possibility disturbed detectives because it meant the offender could pass unnoticed among the very communities he terrorized. Every grocery store, every gas station, every workplace, every neighborhood gathering. He might stand nearby without attracting attention. That thought lingered in the minds of both investigators and the public. As 1977 drew to a close, law enforcement had assembled one of the largest collections of evidence ever gathered in pursuit of an unknown serial offender. The crimes were unquestionably linked. The investigative effort continued expanding. Communities remained on edge, yet the identity of the East Area rapist remained hidden. No one could know that the violence was approaching another transformation, one that would carry the offender beyond Sacramento across California and into an even darker chapter marked not only by sexual assaults, but by a series of homicides that would ultimately lead investigators to rename the same elusive predator once again. The fear that gripped Northern California showed no sign of fading as 1978 began. Detectives had spent countless hours studying maps, comparing witness statements, analyzing crime scenes, and following thousands of investigative leads, yet the unknown offender remained invisible. Every failed attempt to capture him strengthened the perception that he possessed an almost supernatural ability to disappear. But there was nothing supernatural about the man investigators were hunting. He was disciplined, patient, methodical. He understood geography, routine, and timing. Most importantly, he adapted. Every increase in police patrols forced him to evolve. Every public warning encouraged him to alter his methods. Instead of making mistakes under pressure, he appeared to become even more calculating. The investigation had reached a dangerous point where the offender seemed to be learning as quickly as the detectives pursuing him. Throughout 1978, attacks continued across the Sacramento region and neighboring communities. The East Area rapist no longer appeared confined to one specific neighborhood. His geographic range expanded. Investigators found themselves coordinating across county lines with increasing urgency. Communication between agencies improved, but law enforcement in the late 1970s still lacked the centralized information systems available decades later. Reports were exchanged through meetings, telephone calls, mailed documents, and personal contacts. Detectives often relied upon handwritten notes and physical maps spread across conference tables. Every connection required careful comparison by investigators rather than automated computer analysis. The workload became enormous. Yet patterns continued emerging. The offender consistently demonstrated extraordinary preparation. Crime scene examinations revealed that he frequently entered residential areas long before the attacks. Investigators believed he sometimes hid in backyards, vacant lots, or greenbelts, quietly observing families as evening routines unfolded. Lights switched off. Televisions went dark. Neighbors returned home from work. Dogs settled. The neighborhood gradually fell silent. Only then did the offender begin moving. Witnesses occasionally recalled seeing bicycles abandoned near canals or wooded areas after attacks. Others reported unfamiliar vehicles parked several streets away from crime scenes. Some residents remembered hearing footsteps outside bedroom windows shortly before midnight. Individually, these observations offered little certainty. Collectively, they suggested a predator who preferred patience over haste. He did not simply arrive. He infiltrated. The psychological sophistication displayed during the crimes increasingly concerned behavioral investigators. Victims described an offender who sought complete control over every moment. He frequently appeared prepared for unexpected developments. If one entry point proved unsuitable, he adapted. If neighbors remained awake longer than anticipated, he waited. If conditions changed, he sometimes abandoned one opportunity before selecting another. Such flexibility reflected careful planning rather than impulsive violence. Detectives concluded they were facing someone capable of maintaining emotional discipline under intense pressure. This made him exceptionally difficult to predict. Investigators also continued receiving reports of suspicious prowling activities occurring days before attacks. Residents discovered footprints beneath bedroom windows. Fence gates were found standing open. Garden furniture had been moved. Missing household objects later appeared elsewhere on the property. Some victims remembered hearing noises during previous nights but dismissed them as animals or neighborhood disturbances. Only after the attacks did those seemingly ordinary events acquire terrifying significance. The offender appeared to conduct rehearsals. He studied escape routes. He tested windows and gates. He evaluated lighting conditions. He learned the rhythms of each neighborhood before striking. Every crime scene added another layer to the offender's evolving profile. Forensic specialists meticulously photographed evidence, collected fingerprints where available, preserved biological samples, and documented footwear impressions. Although forensic science had not yet reached the DNA, investigators understood the importance of preserving every possible trace. Evidence storage procedures became increasingly rigorous. Experienced detectives recognized that today's insignificant sample might become tomorrow's decisive clue. That foresight would eventually prove invaluable. Public fear reached unprecedented levels. Local newspapers published detailed reports after nearly every confirmed attack. Television broadcasts featured interviews with law enforcement officials urging residents to remain vigilant. Community centers hosted crime prevention seminars attended by hundreds of anxious citizens. Hardware stores struggled to keep deadbolt locks and security lighting in stock. Private alarm companies reported dramatic increases in business. The East Area rapist had fundamentally altered daily life throughout much of Northern California. Ordinary routines disappeared. Children were called indoors earlier. Neighbors checked on one another before bedtime. Families developed elaborate security rituals every evening. Doors locked. Windows checked repeatedly. Exterior lights activated. Dogs brought inside. The rituals provided reassurance, but no guarantee. The offender repeatedly demonstrated his ability to overcome physical barriers through careful planning and persistence. The investigation also revealed another deeply unsettling characteristic. Some victims reported receiving anonymous telephone calls months after the attacks. Investigators documented these incidents carefully. Although technology of the era limited tracing capabilities, detectives recognized that the communications reflected ongoing psychological manipulation. The offender appeared unwilling to relinquish control even after leaving the crime scene. His influence extended into victims' daily lives through fear and uncertainty. Behavioral specialists considered these actions consistent with an offender deriving satisfaction not only from physical violence but also from prolonged emotional domination. Despite extraordinary investigative efforts, no definitive suspect emerged. Thousands of names passed through investigative files. Known offenders, former neighbors, military personnel, individuals reported by anonymous callers. Men observed behaving suspiciously near crime scenes. Every lead demanded careful evaluation. Most ultimately proved unrelated. The absence of meaningful breakthroughs frustrated investigators who increasingly believed the offender lived an otherwise conventional life. His possibility grew stronger because of his consistency. The attacks required time, preparation, immobility, knowledge of residential neighborhoods, the ability to disappear immediately afterward. Such characteristics suggested someone capable of maintaining ordinary employment and social relationships while secretly committing violent crimes. That realization deeply disturbed detectives. If true, the offender could easily blend into any community. As 1978 progressed, another troubling development emerged. The attacks gradually extended farther south into California. Investigators recognized that the offender's operational territory was expanding. This movement complicated coordination among police agencies already struggling with jurisdictional boundaries. Different departments maintained separate evidence systems. Crime classifications varied. Communication remains slower than modern investigators would consider acceptable. Detectives worked tirelessly to overcome these limitations through personal cooperation and regular information sharing. Still, the offender benefited from the fragmented structure of law enforcement at the time. One of the most important investigative achievements during this period involved recognizing that the offender's behavior remained remarkably consistent despite changing locations. Entry methods, control of victims, escape strategies, hit preparation, crime scene organization. These characteristics convinced experienced investigators they were pursuing the same individual even when attacks occurred many miles apart. This conclusion allowed detectives to combine resources more effectively, although identifying the offender remained painfully elusive. The psychological burden upon investigators grew heavier with every new case. Each crime represented another family forever changed, another community shaken, another reminder that despite months of relentless effort, the offender continued operating with apparent confidence. Many detectives later described feeling as though they were constantly reacting instead of preventing. The predator dictated the timetable. Law enforcement responded afterward. That imbalance became one of the investigation's greatest frustrations. Yet beneath the disappointment, investigators refused to surrender. Evidence continued accumulating. Patterns became increasingly refined. Behavioral analysis improved. Every crime expanded the historical record that future investigators would someday inherit. Unknown to everyone involved, the preserved evidence was already carrying the answer. Science simply had not yet reached the point where it could reveal it. By the close of 1978, California remained trapped in a relentless cycle of fear. The East Area Rapist had committed dozens of violent attacks while repeatedly escaping capture. Entire communities wondered when he would strike again. Detectives feared the offender's confidence was growing. Those fears would soon prove justified. The violence was about to escalate once more. The predator who had terrorized Northern California through serial sexual assaults would soon begin committing murders in Southern California, leading investigators in another region to give the same unknown offender a different name, one that would become permanently embedded in American criminal history, the original Night Stalker. It would take decades before investigators finally realized that the East Area Rapist, the original Night Stalker, and the elusive burglar once known as the Visalia Ransacker were all the same man. The transition was as shocking as it was difficult to recognize. For years, investigators in Northern California had pursued an offender known as the East Area Rapist, a man whose carefully planned nighttime attacks had terrorized entire communities while leaving victims alive. Hundreds of miles to the south, however, detectives would soon begin investigating an entirely different series of crimes. These cases involved murdered couples inside their own homes. The scenes displayed extraordinary violence, calculated preparation, and chilling signs that the killer had spent time inside the residences before and after the attacks. At first, no one suspected that the same individual responsible for dozens of sexual assaults around Sacramento had evolved into a serial murderer operating in Southern California. The distance between jurisdictions, differences in investigative systems, and the absence of modern DNA technology concealed the connection. For the offender, geography became another weapon. For investigators, it became another obstacle. The first murders later linked to the offender occurred in Goleta, Santa Barbara County. On the night of October 1st, SIL 1979, 30-year-old Robert Offerman and 35-year-old Deborah Alexandra Manning were inside Offerman's condominium when an intruder entered after dark. Both victims were bound before being shot. Investigators immediately recognized signs of a carefully organized offender. There was no evidence of forced entry consistent with a hurried invasion. Instead, the crime scene suggested patience, preparation, and confidence. The killer had controlled the environment before carrying out the murders. Santa Barbara County detectives began documenting every available piece of evidence: fingerprints, footwear impressions, biological evidence, ballistics, crime scene photographs. Every detail was preserved according to the best forensic standards available at the time. Although investigators considered numerous possibilities, no immediate suspect emerged. The murders shocked the community. Residents struggled to understand why two young adults had been attacked inside what should have been the safety of a private home. The randomness of the violence created widespread anxiety. Police increased patrols. Neighborhood meetings multiplied. Yet investigators still lacked a clear understanding of whom they were searching for. Only months later, another attack occurred. On December Ba Ming Nangan Chen Trum by Meek Chen, Dr. Charlene Kate Doolittle and her fiancé, Dr. Lehman Smith, were attacked inside their Ventura County home. Smith was killed. Doolittle survived despite suffering serious injuries. Her survival proved critically important. She provided investigators with first-hand information about the attacker's behavior. Her account revealed striking similarities to crimes committed hundreds of miles away by the East Area rapist. The offender entered during the night. He exercised complete control. He bound the victims. He moved deliberately through the residence. He escaped before officers could intercept him. Yet because the Northern California investigations remained geographically separate, these similarities did not immediately establish a statewide connection. Investigators in Ventura County focused primarily upon evidence available within their own jurisdiction. This separation reflected the realities of law enforcement at the time rather than investigative oversight. Communication among agencies depended upon meetings, telephone calls, mailed reports, and personal relationships. Centralized statewide databases remained limited. Information often moved far more slowly than the offender himself. Meanwhile, detectives studying the Ventura County attack noticed another recurring characteristic. The killer appeared exceptionally familiar with residential neighborhoods. He approached homes without attracting attention. He selected entry points, minimizing visibility. He escaped using routes difficult for responding officers to predict. This level of planning suggested extensive pre-attack surveillance. Behavioral investigators increasingly believed the offender spent considerable time studying victims before entering their homes. In March 1980, the violence continued. Keith and Patrice Harrington were murdered inside their Dana Point home. Again, investigators encountered a crime scene displaying careful preparation. Again, there was evidence that the offender had controlled both victims before killing them. Again, he disappeared into the night without leaving investigators an obvious path toward identification. Southern California newspapers began reporting on what appeared to be a highly organized serial killer targeting couples inside their homes. Detectives assigned a new name reflecting the nighttime nature of the attacks: the original Night Stalker. At that moment, investigators believed they were searching for a murderer operating exclusively in Southern California. They did not yet realize that evidence already collected in Sacramento held the key to understanding his earlier crimes. The offender himself appeared increasingly confident. His crimes demonstrated remarkable consistency despite changing jurisdictions. He selected residential neighborhoods. He preferred nighttime attacks. He displayed extraordinary patience. He controlled victims through planning rather than impulsive force. He escaped before coordinated police searches could contain him. These characteristics remained constant despite the escalation from sexual assaults to homicide. Investigators examining individual crime scenes recognized the sophistication of the offender. What they lacked was the ability to compare every case across California in real time. Another attack followed on August 19, 1980. Manuela Witan was murdered inside her Irvine condominium. Detectives documented familiar elements: nighttime entry, methodical movement through the residence, a carefully organized crime scene, the absence of an identifiable suspect. Community fear expanded throughout Orange County. Residents followed newspaper coverage closely. Many noticed similarities to earlier murders reported elsewhere in Southern California. Police acknowledged potential connections while continuing to examine each investigation individually. Meanwhile, in Sacramento, detectives responsible for the East Area Rapist investigation continued reviewing unsolved sexual assaults. Some investigators privately suspected the offender might eventually commit murder if he had not already done so. The escalating boldness displayed during earlier attacks suggested increasing confidence. Still, without direct evidence linking the Northern and Southern California crimes, such concerns remain speculative. The crucial connection remained hidden within forensic evidence. Crime laboratories preserved biological samples from multiple investigations. Although existing scientific methods could not yet establish definitive DNA profiles, technicians understood the importance of proper storage. Evidence remained cataloged, secured, available for future examination. That quiet professionalism would eventually become one of the investigation's greatest strengths. Throughout 1980, pressure upon Southern California detectives intensified. Multiple homicide investigations demanded enormous resources. Task forces compared reports. Behavioral specialists evaluated offender characteristics. Crime analysts mapped locations. Ballistics experts examined recovered evidence. Every discipline contributed valuable information. Yet one essential question remained unanswered. Who was the original Night Stalker? The offender appeared to exist only during the crimes themselves. Outside those terrifying nights, he vanished completely. Witnesses occasionally reported seeing suspicious individuals near neighborhoods before attacks. Descriptions varied. Some recalled athletic young men. Others remembered bicycles or unfamiliar vehicles. None produced an arrest. Each lead dissolved into uncertainty. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the investigation involved the killer's apparent ability to maintain an ordinary existence between crimes. Detectives increasingly believed he lived among the very communities he terrorized. He likely held employment, maintained relationships, shopped in local stores, passed neighbors on sidewalks. Nothing in his outward appearance apparently distinguished him from thousands of other California residents. This realization haunted investigators because it meant the offender could easily observe police activity while remaining unnoticed himself. By the end of 1980, law enforcement agencies across California were confronting what appeared to be two exceptionally dangerous offenders. Northern investigators pursued the East Area Rapist. Southern investigators hunted the original Night Stalker. Each investigation generated mountains of reports, forensic evidence, witness interviews, and behavioral analysis. Neither had produced an identification. Neither showed signs of ending. Unknown to everyone except the offender, the two investigations were in fact searching for the same man. That hidden truth would remain concealed for decades, allowing Joseph James D'Angelo to continue living an outwardly ordinary life while one of the largest and most complex serial crime investigations in American history slowly expanded around, evidence that science had not yet learned how to fully interpret. The murders in Southern California did not bring the violence to an end. Instead, they deepened one of the greatest investigative mysteries in modern American criminal history. Detectives working hundreds of miles apart remained convinced they were pursuing highly organized offenders, yet the true scope of the crimes still lay hidden. The unknown predator had already transformed from a prolific burglar into a serial sexual offender, and then into a serial murderer, adapting his methods while preserving the core behaviors that defined him. He studied neighborhoods. He watched victims. He struck under the cover of darkness. He exercised complete control before disappearing with astonishing speed. Every successful escape reinforced the illusion that multiple offenders were responsible. The man later identified as Joseph James D'Angelo had managed to conceal not only his identity, but also the full extent of his criminal history. On February 6, 1981, another brutal attack shattered a quiet California neighborhood. Sherry Domingo and Gregory Sanchez were found murdered inside Domingo's residence near Goleta in Santa Barbara County. The scene immediately reminded investigators of earlier murders attributed to the original Night Stalker. Evidence indicated that the offender had entered the home during the night. The victims had attempted to resist. A violent struggle occurred. Despite the confrontation, the killer escaped before law enforcement arrived. Detectives meticulously processed the scene. Photographs documented every room. Ballistics evidence was collected. Biological evidence was preserved. Investigators searched surrounding neighborhoods for witnesses, suspicious vehicles, and unfamiliar individuals. As with previous cases, no immediate suspect emerged. The murders intensified public anxiety throughout the region. Residents questioned whether anyone could truly feel safe inside their own homes. Police departments urged communities to remain vigilant while acknowledging the extraordinary challenges involved in identifying such a disciplined offender. The investigation expanded once again. Crime analysts compared reports from Santa Barbara, Ventura, Orange County, and other jurisdictions. Behavioral similarities became increasingly difficult to ignore. The offender consistently demonstrated patience, preparation, knowledge of residential environments, confidence under pressure. He frequently selected homes offering multiple escape routes. He appeared comfortable moving through darkness. He left investigators with carefully organized crime scenes, but remarkably little information pointing toward his identity. Throughout 1981, detectives continued evaluating possible suspects. Known violent offenders, former military personnel, individuals with burglary histories. Men reported behaving suspiciously near crime scenes. Thousands of investigative hours produced countless interviews. Every lead required verification. Every possibility demanded careful elimination. Despite extraordinary effort, the offender remained unidentified. Law enforcement officers experienced growing frustration. Each murder represented another devastating loss. Another family destroyed. Another reminder that despite years of investigation, the unknown predator continued operating beyond the reach of police. On July 27, Sill, 1981, the final known homicide attributed to the original Night Stalker occurred in Irvine, California. 18-year-old Janelle Cruz was alone at home when the offender entered during the night. She was murdered before the killer once again disappeared. The crime shocked investigators. Janelle was significantly younger than several previous homicide victims. That the offender's operational methods remained strikingly familiar. Nighttime entry, control of the environment, careful planning, a rapid escape. Detectives processed the scene with the same determination that had characterized every earlier investigation. They preserved biological evidence, documented physical traces, interviewed neighbors, reviewed timelines, generated suspect lists. The result remained painfully familiar. No arrest, no confirmed identification. After the murder of Janelle Cruz, something unexpected happened. The killing stopped. The sexual assaults already attributed to the East Area rapist had ended years earlier. Now the murders associated with the original Night Stalker also ceased. The offender disappeared. Investigators could not explain why. Some believed he had died. Others suspected imprisonment for unrelated offenses. Some theorized that relocation had interrupted his activities. Others feared he had simply changed methods again. Without an identified suspect, every explanation remained speculative. The sudden silence became one of the most perplexing aspects of the investigation. Years passed, then decades. The files remained open. Evidence stayed preserved. Victims' families continued waiting. Although active investigative activity naturally fluctuated over time, the cases were never formally forgotten. Cold case detectives periodically reviewed evidence. Laboratory personnel re-examined preserved biological material as forensic science advanced. Each technological improvement generated cautious optimism. Yet throughout the 1980s and much of the 1990s, identifying the offender remained beyond available scientific capability. One significant breakthrough began emerging during the late 20th century. DNA profiling revolutionized criminal investigations. Unlike earlier forensic methods relying upon blood typing or limited biological comparisons, DNA analysis offered investigators the ability to distinguish individuals with remarkable precision. Crime laboratories across the United States gradually revisited historical evidence collected years earlier. Among those preserved samples were biological materials recovered from crimes attributed to both the East Area Rapist and the original Night Stalker. Scientists eventually confirmed that the same unidentified individual was responsible for both crime series. This revelation fundamentally transformed the investigation. For the first time, law enforcement possessed scientific confirmation that the serial sexual assaults in Northern California and the serial murders in Southern California had been committed by one offender. The separate investigations merged into a single historical narrative. As investigators gained greater understanding of the offender's complete criminal history, another realization emerged. Evidence increasingly suggested that the earlier Visalia ransacker burglaries might also be connected. Behavioral similarities, geographic movement, investigative timelines. Over time, detectives assembled a broader picture spanning multiple phases of criminal activity. Although definitive conclusions regarding every early offense required careful evaluation, the emerging pattern pointed toward one extraordinarily versatile offender whose crimes had evolved over many years. The media gradually adopted a new collective name reflecting the offender's full criminal history: Golden State Killer. The title acknowledged that the same unidentified man had committed crimes across California under several previously separate identities. The new name also reflected the immense challenge facing investigators. They were no longer pursuing isolated offenses. They were attempting to identify one of the most prolific serial predators in American history. Even with DNA evidence establishing connections among the crimes, investigators faced a fundamental obstacle. They possessed the offender's genetic profile. They did not know his name. National DNA databases compared profiles obtained from convicted offenders and certain criminal investigations. If the unknown offender had never submitted DNA through those systems, no match would appear. Year after year, detectives searched those databases. Nothing. The profile remained unidentified. The investigation entered another prolonged period of uncertainty. Families continued waiting. Communities remembered. Retired detectives wondered whether they would ever witness an arrest. Many officers who had worked the earliest cases reached the ends of their careers without learning the offender's identity. Some died before the mystery was solved. Others continued advocating for renewed examination of preserved evidence whenever scientific advances occurred. Their persistence ensured the investigation never disappeared completely. By the early 21st century, the Golden State Killer investigation had become one of the most famous unsolved serial crime cases in the United States. Books examined the crimes. Journalists revisited historical investigations. Victims courageously shared their experiences. Cold case specialists continued reviewing evidence. The offender himself, however, remained invisible. He had successfully avoided identification for decades. He had apparently built an ordinary life while investigators searched endlessly for the man responsible for dozens of sexual assaults and multiple murders. What neither he nor most investigators fully appreciated was that another scientific revolution was quietly approaching. Unlike traditional DNA databases, this emerging investigative approach would not require the offender's own DNA to identify him. Instead, it would search through family history itself, a distant relative, an unexpected genetic connection, a forgotten branch of a family tree. The answer that had eluded detectives for more than 40 years was no longer hidden in the crime scenes alone. It was waiting inside generations of shared ancestry, where advances in forensic genetic genealogy were about to transform one of America's greatest unsolved mysteries into one of its most remarkable investigative breakthroughs. For decades, the Golden State Killer investigation existed in a strange state of suspended time. The crimes had ended, but the fear they created never completely disappeared. Detectives retired. New investigators inherited shelves lined with aging case files. Evidence remained sealed inside carefully labeled containers. Maps once covered with handwritten notes yellowed with age. Victims rebuilt their lives as best they could, yet many admitted that every unexpected sound in the middle of the night still carried memories of those terrifying years. The unknown offender had vanished from public view, but he had never disappeared from the minds of those determined to identify him. Investigators understood one simple truth. Somewhere in California, or perhaps somewhere far beyond, it was entirely possible that the man responsible was living an ordinary life, surrounded by neighbors who had no idea they shared a community with one of the most elusive serial predators in American history. Throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, forensic science advanced at an extraordinary pace. DNA profiling became increasingly sophisticated. Crime laboratories developed techniques capable of recovering usable genetic material from increasingly limited biological samples. Historical evidence once considered unsuitable for testing was re-examined using improved laboratory methods. Cold case units across the United States began solving murders that had remained unsolved for decades. Each successful identification strengthened confidence that science could eventually answer questions investigators once believed impossible. The Golden State Killer investigation naturally became one of the highest priorities for renewed forensic review. Scientists carefully reanalyzed preserved biological evidence collected during the original investigations. The DNA profile remained remarkably consistent. The offender's genetic identity had been captured decades earlier. The challenge remained exactly the same. No name accompanied it. Investigators repeatedly searched state and national offender databases. Each search produced disappointment. No qualifying DNA profile matched the evidence. The unknown man had either never entered those databases or had avoided circumstances requiring DNA collection under the laws that existed at the time. Traditional investigative methods reached another dead end. Still, detectives refused to abandon the case. Retired investigators frequently returned to consult with younger officers. Experience accumulated over decades remained invaluable. Veteran detectives remembered witness interviews conducted long before computerized record systems. They understood subtle details that rarely appeared fully in written reports. Many continued reviewing evidence voluntarily, driven by a commitment that extended well beyond formal retirement. Their persistence reflected the extraordinary emotional weight carried by the investigation. The victims had waited too long for answers. Every new scientific development deserved careful evaluation. Meanwhile, advances outside traditional forensic laboratories quietly began creating entirely new investigative possibilities. Commercial genealogy services experienced enormous public popularity. Millions of people voluntarily submitted DNA samples, hoping to learn more about family origins, ancestral migration, and distant relatives. Most participants never imagined that their genetic information could eventually contribute to criminal investigations. Professional genealogists became increasingly skilled at reconstructing extended family trees using public records, birth certificates, marriage records, military service documents, obituaries, newspaper archives, census information, property records. Together, these ordinary historical documents allowed researchers to connect generations of families with remarkable precision. Initially, genealogy remained almost entirely separate from criminal investigation. Gradually, however, investigators recognized a revolutionary possibility. Even if an unknown offender had never submitted DNA personally, one of his relatives might have done so voluntarily through genealogical research. That relative would not identify the offender directly. Instead, shared genetic markers could reveal family relationships. Investigators could then work forward through historical records, eliminating individuals until one person remained consistent with the available evidence. The concept became known as forensic genetic genealogy. It represented one of the most significant investigative innovations since the introduction of DNA profiling itself. Importantly, genealogy did not replace traditional police work. It generated investigative leads. Those leads still required independent confirmation through established forensic procedures before any arrest could occur. This distinction remained essential, both scientifically and legally. As interest in forensic genealogy grew, several investigators recognized its potential for exceptionally difficult cold cases. The Golden State Killer investigation stood among the most compelling candidates. The preserved DNA profile was strong. The offender had remained unidentified through conventional database searches. The crime spanned multiple jurisdictions and decades. If genealogy could identify anyone, many believed this case offered an ideal opportunity. Investigators began exploring how the new methodology might apply. Careful legal and ethical considerations guided every step. The goal remained straightforward: use available scientific tools responsibly while respecting established legal standards. Researchers uploaded the unknown DNA profile into genealogy databases that permitted law enforcement use under their applicable policies at the time. The results did not reveal the offender's name. Instead, they identified distant biological relatives, second cousins, third cousins, individuals separated by generations from the unknown suspect. For most criminal investigations, such distant relationships might appear almost meaningless. For experienced genealogists, they represented the beginning of a solvable puzzle. Professional genealogists started reconstructing enormous family trees. They examined historical birth records, marriage licenses, death certificates, military records, newspaper announcements, census data. Generation after generation gradually emerged. Branches expanded. Families divided. Names accumulated by the hundreds. The work demanded extraordinary patience. Unlike television dramas portraying instant breakthroughs, forensic genealogy often requires weeks or months of meticulous historical research. Every relationship must be verified, every assumption tested, every inconsistency resolved. As genealogists narrowed the family tree, investigators applied traditional police analysis. They considered age, sex, geographic history, employment, known residences. Could any individual plausibly have committed the crimes beginning in the mid-1970s? Did historical movements correspond with the locations of the offenses? Did timelines align? One candidate gradually attracted increasing attention. His name was Joseph James D'Angelo. Born in 1945, D'Angelo had served in the United States Navy before later becoming a police officer in California during the 1970s. Public records showed that he had lived in areas relevant to portions of the investigation during critical periods. The information immediately interested detectives, though they understood genealogy alone could never establish guilt. Evidence, not suspicion, would determine the outcome. Investigators quietly began conducting surveillance. They observed D'Angelo without alerting him. The investigation proceeded cautiously. If he truly was the offender, detectives wanted incontrovertible forensic confirmation before making any arrest. Surveillance teams documented his daily routine. By this time, D'Angelo was an elderly man living what appeared to be an ordinary suburban life. Neighbors generally knew him as a retired resident. Few suspected that investigators were watching one of the most significant cold case suspects in American history. The contrast was extraordinary. For more than 40 years, police had searched for a masked predator who moved through darkness with astonishing confidence. Now they quietly observed an aging retiree mowing his lawn, shopping, and performing everyday activities. Appearances, investigators reminded themselves, proved nothing. Only DNA could answer the question. Detectives therefore waited patiently for an opportunity to obtain a discarded biological sample that could legally be compared with the preserved crime scene evidence. The strategy reflected established investigative practice. If the recovered sample matched the DNA preserved from the Golden State Killer crimes, decades of uncertainty would finally end. If it did not, investigators would continue searching. The science would decide. The evidence collected during the 1970s and early 1980s had remained silent for more than 40 years. Now, because generations of investigators had preserved it with extraordinary care, it stood on the verge of revealing the identity of the man who had successfully hidden behind multiple names: the Visalia ransacker, the East Area rapist, the original Night Stalker, and finally, the Golden State Killer. The investigation that had begun before DNA profiling even existed was about to enter its most decisive moment, proving that while offenders may escape capture for years, carefully preserved evidence can possess a memory far longer than any human lifetime. For more than 4 decades, the unknown man behind the Golden State Killer investigation had existed as a collection of evidence rather than a face. Detectives knew his habits. They understood his methods. They had mapped his movements across California, preserved his biological evidence, analyzed his behavior, and reconstructed the chronology of dozens of violent crimes. Yet they had never spoken his name because they did not know it. Now, in the spring of 2018, everything depended upon one final comparison. Years of genealogy, surveillance, forensic science, and patient investigative work had narrowed the search to a single individual. Joseph James D'Angelo was no longer simply a name appearing somewhere within an enormous family tree. He had become the focus of one of the most significant cold case investigations in American history. Still, investigators refused to celebrate. Suspicion was not evidence. A family tree was not proof. Only DNA could determine whether decades of searching had finally reached the truth. Surveillance teams maintained careful observation. The operation remained intentionally quiet. Investigators understood that alerting the suspect prematurely could jeopardize years of work. Every movement required discipline. Every report required accuracy. The objective was straightforward: obtain a biological sample legally abandoned by D'Angelo in a public setting and compare it with the preserved crime scene DNA. If the samples matched, investigators would possess powerful scientific evidence connecting him to the crimes. If they did not, the search would continue. During surveillance, detectives observed what appeared to be an ordinary retired man. He drove familiar routes. He performed household chores. He interacted with neighbors. Nothing about his public routine reflected the terrifying offender described by victims decades earlier. That contrast profoundly affected many investigators. For years, they had imagined the Golden State Killer as a shadow moving silently through suburban darkness. Now they watched an elderly man living an apparently unremarkable life. The passage of time had transformed his appearance, but the preserved DNA remained unchanged. Eventually, investigators recovered discarded biological material associated with D'Angelo. The sample was submitted for laboratory comparison. Scientists conducted the analysis using established forensic procedures. There was no dramatic announcement, no immediate confrontation. Laboratory work demands precision rather than speed. Every step required verification. Chain of custody documentation remained meticulous. Independent review ensured scientific reliability. Then the results arrived. The DNA matched. After more than 40 years, the unknown genetic profile preserved from multiple crime scenes finally had a name: Joseph James D'Angelo. For investigators who had dedicated years or entire careers to the case, the confirmation represented an extraordinary moment. Some had begun working the investigation before DNA profiling even existed. Others inherited the files decades later. Many had retired without expecting to witness an identification. Now, preserved evidence collected during the late 1970s and early 1980s had accomplished exactly what generations of detectives hoped it someday might. The science had spoken with remarkable certainty. Planning shifted immediately toward arrest. Investigators carefully evaluated every operational detail. Although D'Angelo was now in his 70s, detectives approached the operation with caution. They could not assume his physical condition eliminated potential risks. Officers prepared arrest teams. Command personnel coordinated communication among participating agencies. Prosecutors reviewed available evidence. The investigation that had remained open for decades was finally approaching its most public moment. On April 24, 2018, law enforcement officers arrested Joseph James D'Angelo outside his home in Citrus Heights, California. The operation concluded without the violent confrontation many had feared. News spread rapidly across the United States. Within hours, national media outlets interrupted regular programming. Headlines announced that authorities believed they had identified the Golden State Killer. For victims and survivors, the announcement carried emotions difficult to describe. Some expressed relief. Others reacted with disbelief. Many had spent decades wondering whether the offender would ever be identified. Now, after 40 years, investigators announced that science had finally uncovered the man they had sought for generations. Retired detectives appeared before television cameras. Many acknowledged that they never stopped believing the case could be solved. Some became visibly emotional while describing the moment they learned about the DNA confirmation. The arrest represented far more than a successful investigation. It validated decades of evidence preservation, interagency cooperation, and scientific progress. Without those combined efforts, the case might have remained unsolved indefinitely. As news organizations examined D'Angelo's background, another unsettling picture emerged. He had once served as a police officer. Public records confirmed that he worked for the Exeter Police Department during the mid-1970s before later joining the Auburn Police Department. His employment ended after he was arrested for shoplifting in 1979, after which he was dismissed from the Auburn Police Department. Investigators noted that his law enforcement experience provided one possible explanation for certain aspects of his criminal behavior, such as familiarity with patrol practices and investigative procedures. However, prosecutors relied upon forensic evidence rather than occupational history to establish the case against him. The DNA evidence remained the cornerstone of the prosecution. Following the arrest, investigators executed search warrants at D'Angelo's residence. Evidence collected during those searches underwent careful forensic examination. Authorities also reviewed historical records accumulated over decades. Every investigative step followed established legal procedures. Given the extraordinary public interest surrounding the case, officials emphasized accuracy over speculation. Many details remained sealed while prosecutors prepared formal charges. Victims and surviving family members began learning that the unknown offender had finally been identified. Some described feeling as though time had stopped the moment they heard the announcement. Others explained that decades of unanswered questions suddenly shifted into a new reality. The uncertainty surrounding identity had ended. Legal accountability, however, still lay ahead. Communities that experienced the crimes during the 1970s and early 1980s also reacted with remarkable emotion. Residents remembered neighborhood meetings, locked windows, sleepless nights. Children called indoors before sunset. The fear that once dominated entire regions of California returned briefly through memories, but this time accompanied by something absent for 40 years: answers. The arrest also transformed forensic genetic genealogy from an emerging investigative technique into an internationally recognized tool. Law enforcement agencies across the United States began reevaluating unsolved cases involving preserved biological evidence. Cold case investigators recognized that the methodology used in the Golden State Killer investigation might assist numerous other historical investigations. The case therefore influenced criminal justice far beyond California. It demonstrated that carefully preserved evidence, combined with responsible scientific innovation, could overcome obstacles once considered impossible. Yet investigators remained careful in their public statements. An arrest did not replace the judicial process. Charges required proof in court. Evidence required legal scrutiny. The presumption of innocence remained an essential component of the justice system. Authorities therefore focused upon documenting every forensic conclusion with extraordinary precision. The decades-long investigation had finally identified its primary suspect. Now prosecutors would undertake the equally important task of presenting the evidence within the courtroom. For many detectives, however, one quiet realization overshadowed everything else. The man they had searched for under 3 different names, the Visalia ransacker, the East Area rapist, and the original Night Stalker, had never truly disappeared. He had simply continued living an outwardly ordinary life while the evidence patiently waited for science to catch up. In the end, it was not luck that ended one of America's greatest criminal mysteries. It was evidence preserved with care, investigators who refused to surrender, and scientific advances that transformed forgotten traces into undeniable truth. After more than 40 years of silence, the Golden State Killer was no longer an unknown predator hiding in history. He was Joseph James DeAngelo, under arrest, awaiting the legal process that victims, investigators, and entire California communities had been waiting decades to see begin. The arrest of Joseph James DeAngelo marked the end of one mystery, but it did not mark the end of the investigation in many ways. It opened an entirely new chapter. For more than 40 years, detectives had concentrated on one overriding objective: identify the unknown offender. That objective had finally been achieved through forensic genetic genealogy and DNA confirmation. Now investigators faced an equally demanding task, transforming decades of evidence, collected by multiple agencies across several jurisdictions, into a comprehensive criminal prosecution capable of withstanding intense legal scrutiny. Every report written in the 1970s, every photograph taken at crime scenes, every preserved biological sample, every witness interview, every chain of custody document, everything would now be examined once again, not in search of a suspect, but in preparation for court. The scale of the investigation was extraordinary. The crimes attributed to DeAngelo stretched across numerous California counties, different police departments, different sheriff's offices, different prosecutors, different investigative teams. Many of the original detectives had retired. Some had passed away. Others were called back to assist prosecutors by explaining investigative decisions made decades earlier. Historical case files were retrieved from archives. Evidence storage facilities reopened sealed containers that had remained untouched for years. Laboratory records were reviewed line by line. Nothing could be overlooked. The prosecution required meticulous preparation because every allegation had to be supported by admissible evidence. DNA remained the central pillar of the case. Forensic scientists carefully documented how biological evidence collected decades earlier had been preserved. They explained the scientific procedures used to generate DNA profiles. They described the comparison process linking crime scene evidence to Joseph James DeAngelo. Importantly, investigators also emphasized the role of forensic genetic genealogy. The genealogy research had not itself established guilt. Instead, it generated an investigative lead that directed detectives toward DeAngelo. The decisive confirmation came from traditional forensic DNA comparison conducted according to established scientific standards. That distinction remained legally significant. Genealogy pointed investigators in the right direction. DNA provided the evidentiary match. Meanwhile, prosecutors faced another challenge. The Golden State Killer investigation involved crimes committed over many years under different case names. The Visalia ransacker, the East Area rapist, the original Night Stalker, the Golden State Killer. Investigators carefully reconstructed the historical evolution of those investigations, demonstrating how advances in forensic science gradually established that the same offender had committed crimes previously believed to involve separate individuals. The chronology itself became an important component of understanding the investigation. Victims and survivors were informed about upcoming legal proceedings. Many had waited decades for this moment. Some had rebuilt their lives far from California. Others remained in the same communities where the crimes occurred. Every individual processed the news differently. For some, the arrest brought profound relief. For others, it reopened memories they had spent years trying to manage. Victim advocates worked closely with survivors throughout the legal process, recognizing that the emotional impact of renewed court proceedings could be considerable. Public interest remained intense. News organizations from around the world reported developments almost daily. Journalists revisited the original investigations. Television documentaries examined the history of the crimes. Former detectives participated in interviews describing decades of investigative effort. For many viewers, the story represented far more than the arrest of one offender. It demonstrated how scientific innovation had transformed criminal investigation. Law enforcement agencies across the United States watched the proceedings closely. Cold case units began reviewing unsolved investigations involving preserved biological evidence. Forensic genetic genealogy, although still relatively new within criminal investigations, had suddenly demonstrated extraordinary potential. Many departments recognized that historical evidence once considered insufficient might now provide entirely new investigative opportunities. The Golden State Killer investigation quickly became one of the most influential examples of modern cold case methodology. During the pretrial period, D'Angelo appeared in court under heavy security. His public appearance surprised many observers. The image presented in court contrasted sharply with the terrifying figure described by victims decades earlier. Time had changed his appearance dramatically, yet prosecutors reminded the court that the evidence concerned actions committed many years earlier. Age did not alter preserved forensic evidence. It did not change documented crime scenes. It did not erase the testimony of victims or the scientific conclusions established through DNA analysis. Legal proceedings moved deliberately. Given the complexity of the investigation, prosecutors and defense attorneys addressed numerous procedural matters before the case advanced further. The judicial system required careful review of evidence accumulated across multiple jurisdictions. Every charge carried its own historical documentation. Every investigative step required legal examination. Throughout this period, officials continued emphasizing the importance of allowing the court process to proceed according to established legal principles. Outside the courtroom, investigators reflected upon how dramatically criminal investigation had evolved since the crimes first occurred. When the earliest burglaries began during the mid-1970s, personal computers were rare. DNA profiling did not exist. Digital evidence systems had not yet transformed policing. Crime scene photography relied entirely upon film. Communication among agencies required telephone calls, mailed reports, and face-to-face meetings. By the time D'Angelo appeared in court decades later, forensic science had entered an entirely different era. DNA technology had revolutionized identification. Digital databases accelerated information sharing. Forensic genealogy had created investigative possibilities once considered unimaginable. The Golden State Killer investigation spanned both worlds. It began in one scientific age and concluded in another. Investigators repeatedly acknowledged that none of those advances would have mattered if the original evidence had not been collected and preserved with extraordinary care. Crime scene technicians working in the 1970s could not possibly have predicted forensic genetic genealogy. Nevertheless, they followed professional procedures. They documented evidence carefully. They maintained chain of custody. They protected biological samples despite having no way to foresee precisely how future laboratories might analyze them. Their diligence became one of the defining reasons the case was ultimately solved. The investigation also renewed discussion about cooperation between agencies. Originally, jurisdictional boundaries had complicated recognition that multiple crime series involved the same offender. Over time, improved communication, forensic analysis, and collaborative investigation overcame those barriers. Detectives from different counties who once pursued apparently unrelated offenders eventually realized they had spent decades investigating one man. That realization underscored the importance of information sharing in complex criminal investigations. As prosecutors continued preparing the case, victims prepared for the possibility of speaking publicly once again. Many had remained anonymous for years. Others chose to share their experiences in support of broader conversations about survival, resilience, and the long pursuit of justice. Their willingness to participate reminded the public that behind every forensic breakthrough stood real people whose lives had been permanently changed by violence. The Golden State Killer investigation had always been about more than identifying one offender. It had always been about restoring truth to those who had lived with uncertainty for decades. By the end of 2019, the prosecution had assembled one of the most extensive collections of historical criminal evidence ever presented against a single serial offender. The investigation that began with unexplained burglaries in suburban California had evolved into a landmark example of forensic science, interagency cooperation, and extraordinary investigative persistence. One final stage remained. The courtroom would determine legal accountability. For the victims, their families, and the detectives who had refused to let the evidence be forgotten, that moment represented the culmination of more than 40 years of unwavering commitment to a single goal that one day the unknown predator who had hidden behind darkness, distance, and time would be required to answer for the crimes that had haunted California for generations. The courtroom where Joseph James D'Angelo finally faced justice bore little resemblance to the California that had first been terrorized by the unknown predator more than 4 decades earlier. Entire neighborhoods had changed. Children who once lived in fear had grown into grandparents. Detectives who had chased a shadow through the 1970s had long since retired, and many were now elderly themselves. Some never lived to witness the day they had spent their careers hoping would arrive. Yet the evidence they preserved endured. Every carefully documented report, every crime scene photograph, every biological sample, and every investigative decision formed the foundation of a prosecution unlike any California had seen before. The legal process was no longer about discovering who had committed the crimes. DNA had answered that question. Now the court had to establish accountability under the law for one of the most extensive serial crime investigations in American history. The prosecution brought together cases from multiple California jurisdictions: Sacramento County, Contra Costa County, Santa Barbara County, Ventura County, Orange County. Each jurisdiction contributed evidence relating to crimes committed within its authority. Coordinating such a large prosecution required extraordinary cooperation. Investigators, prosecutors, forensic scientists, victim advocates, and legal staff worked together to organize decades of documentation into a coherent presentation. The complexity reflected the offender's own history. His crimes had crossed county boundaries. His investigations had crossed generations. Now, the judicial process had to bring those separate histories together. Because many offenses occurred decades earlier, prosecutors relied heavily upon preserved forensic evidence alongside historical investigative records and victim testimony. DNA comparisons remained central. Laboratory experts prepared to explain the scientific methods linking D'Angelo to numerous crime scenes. Chain of custody records demonstrated that biological evidence had been preserved according to professional standards. The extraordinary passage of time increased the importance of meticulous documentation. Every transfer of evidence, every laboratory examination, every storage procedure, Each required careful verification before presentation in court. Meanwhile, victims prepared for one of the most emotionally difficult moments of their lives. Many had spent decades rebuilding after unimaginable trauma. Some had rarely spoken publicly about what happened. Others had dedicated years to supporting fellow survivors. Now they faced the possibility of confronting the man investigators believed had changed their lives forever. Victim advocates remained closely involved throughout the proceedings, recognizing that justice often carries emotional burdens alongside legal significance. One of the most important developments occurred in 2020. Rather than proceed through lengthy individual trials across multiple jurisdictions, prosecutors and defense attorneys reached a comprehensive resolution. Joseph James D'Angelo agreed to plead guilty to numerous charges, including multiple counts of murder, while also admitting responsibility for many additional crimes that could not be separately prosecuted because of applicable statutes of limitations. The agreement ensured formal legal accountability without requiring survivors and victims' families to endure years of repeated courtroom testimony. Importantly, the plea did not diminish the seriousness of the offenses. Instead, it established responsibility through D'Angelo's own admissions while avoiding the uncertainty and duration of numerous separate trials. The plea hearings became historic events. Courtrooms filled with victims, investigators, journalists, and members of the public. Many individuals who had devoted decades to the investigation sat only a short distance from one another. Retired detectives observed proceedings alongside younger investigators who had helped bring the case to completion through modern forensic methods. Generations of law enforcement were united by one investigation. During the hearings, prosecutors outlined the extraordinary chronology of the crimes. They described the burglaries attributed to the Visalia ransacker. They reviewed the serial sexual assaults committed by the East Area rapist. They detailed the murders later associated with the original Night Stalker. Together, these crimes form the criminal history of the individual now known internationally as the Golden State Killer. The courtroom presentation illustrated not only the scale of the violence, but also the persistence required to uncover the truth. Victim impact statements became some of the most powerful moments of the proceedings. Survivors described how the crimes affected every aspect of their lives. Some spoke about fear that endured for decades. Others discussed interrupted careers, damaged relationships, and lasting psychological consequences. Family members of murder victims explained the profound absence left behind by loved ones whose futures had been stolen. These statements reminded everyone present that the investigation was never solely about forensic science or criminal procedure. Behind every case, numbers stood human lives permanently altered by violence. Throughout the proceedings, D'Angelo remained largely silent. His courtroom appearances attracted intense media attention. Observers noted the contrast between the elderly defendant and the athletic offender described by witnesses during the 1970s. Time had changed his appearance. It had not changed the evidence. The preserved DNA remained as scientifically reliable as when first analyzed. The historical records remained intact. The victim's experiences remained real. Age did not erase responsibility. Investigators also reflected upon the remarkable journey of the evidence itself. Biological samples collected before DNA profiling existed had survived decades of technological change. Crime scene photographs taken with film cameras now appeared within digital courtroom presentations. Handwritten reports prepared by detectives in the 1970s became exhibits supporting one of the most significant cold case prosecutions in American history. The investigation itself had become a bridge connecting two entirely different eras of criminal justice. The public reaction extended far beyond California. Law enforcement agencies throughout the United States studied the prosecution carefully. Cold case units recognized that the successful resolution demonstrated the extraordinary value of preserving evidence indefinitely. Cases once considered unsolvable suddenly appeared worthy of renewed examination. Forensic genetic genealogy, although requiring careful ethical and legal safeguards, had fundamentally expanded investigative possibilities. The Golden State Killer prosecution therefore influenced not only one criminal case, but also the future direction of cold case investigation across the country. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the proceedings was the sense of historical continuity. Some detectives present remembered investigating the earliest burglaries nearly half a century earlier. Others had entered law enforcement long after the crimes ended. Yet both groups contributed to the same pursuit of justice. The investigation belonged to no single generation. It became a shared commitment carried forward year after year until science finally revealed what determination alone could not. As the hearings concluded, one reality became unmistakably clear. The unknown predator who had hidden behind masks, darkness, changing crime patterns, and decades of silence could no longer escape history. His identity had been established. His crimes had been documented. His responsibility had been acknowledged before the court. Only one final step remained: the formal sentencing that would close one of America's longest and most complex serial crime investigations, while giving victims, investigators, and entire California communities the opportunity to witness the legal conclusion of a search that had lasted more than 40 years. The sentencing phase marked the final judicial reckoning for crimes that had haunted California for more than 4 decades. For many survivors and families, this was not simply another court hearing. It was the first opportunity to stand in the same room as the man whose identity had remained unknown through much of their lives. The masked intruder who had once moved silently through suburban neighborhoods was now an elderly defendant seated before a judge, surrounded not by darkness but by decades of evidence, countless investigators, and the people whose lives his crimes had forever changed. The transformation was extraordinary. The fear that had once belonged entirely to the victims had shifted. Now it was the criminal who faced the certainty of justice, built patiently through 40 years of persistence, scientific progress, and unwavering determination. In August 2020, the sentencing hearings began in Sacramento. Because of the extraordinary number of victims and affected families, the proceedings extended over several days. The court allowed survivors and relatives of murder victims to deliver victim impact statements. Many had waited decades for this opportunity. Some had prepared written remarks. Others chose to speak directly from memory. Every statement reflected a different life. Every voice carried a different history. Yet together they described the enormous human cost of one man's crimes. Some survivors recalled the overwhelming fear that followed the attacks. They described years of checking locks repeatedly before going to sleep, sleepless nights, anxiety triggered by ordinary household sounds, the loss of confidence that home was a place of safety. Many explained that although decades had passed, memories remained vivid. The passage of time had softened neither the facts nor their emotional consequences. Family members of murder victims spoke about birthdays that were never celebrated together, children who grew up without parents, parents who buried sons and daughters, relationships permanently interrupted by violence. Their statements reminded everyone in the courtroom that every investigative file represented a real family whose history had been divided into 2 parts: life before the crime, life after the crime. Several retired investigators also attended portions of the proceedings. For them, the hearings represented the conclusion of careers devoted to solving crimes that many once believed would never be resolved. Some had investigated the earliest East Area rapist attacks during the 1970s. Others joined later as homicide detectives examining murders attributed to the original Night Stalker. Still others became involved decades afterward through cold case reviews and DNA analysis. Although they belonged to different generations of law enforcement, they shared one remarkable experience. They had all pursued the same offender without realizing how long the search would ultimately last. Throughout the hearings, prosecutors summarized the evidence supporting the charges. They explained how biological material collected decades earlier had been preserved. They described the scientific development of DNA profiling. They outlined the role of forensic genetic genealogy in generating the investigative lead that ultimately directed detectives toward Joseph James D'Angelo. The prosecution carefully distinguished between genealogy and evidentiary DNA comparison. Genealogy identified a possible suspect. Traditional forensic DNA testing confirmed the match. That distinction reflected the investigative process that transformed scientific possibility into courtroom evidence. Observers noted the extraordinary contrast between the technology available when the crimes occurred and the technology that eventually solved them. When the earliest attacks began during the mid-1970s, detectives relied primarily upon fingerprints, witness interviews, physical surveillance, and conventional forensic examinations. Computers played only limited investigative roles. DNA identification did not yet exist. By the time D'Angelo stood before the court, investigators could identify individuals through sophisticated genetic analysis unimaginable when the evidence had first been collected. The investigation had therefore become a living history of forensic science itself. During the proceedings, D'Angelo briefly addressed the court. His statement was short. It attracted significant public attention because it represented one of the few occasions on which he spoke during the legal process. The court ultimately focused not upon his remarks, but upon the overwhelming body of evidence and the voices of the victims who had waited decades for accountability. The sentencing reflected the seriousness and scope of the crimes. The judge imposed multiple consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Given D'Angelo's age and the nature of the convictions, the sentence ensured he would spend the remainder of his life in prison. The legal proceedings had reached their conclusion. The criminal investigation had achieved its primary objective. Responsibility had been established according to law. For many victims, however, the conclusion remained deeply complex. Justice and healing are not identical. A courtroom can establish accountability. It cannot restore stolen years. It cannot erase trauma. It cannot return loved ones lost to violence. Many survivors acknowledged feeling relief after the sentencing. Others described emotions that were far more complicated. The legal process answered one question while leaving countless personal questions beyond the reach of any court. What would life have been without the crimes? How might families have grown differently? How many ordinary moments had been permanently altered? Those questions possessed no legal answers. The sentencing, nevertheless, marked an essential historical milestone. One of America's longest-running serial investigations had reached a lawful conclusion supported by overwhelming forensic evidence. The significance extended beyond California. Police agencies throughout the United States examined the Golden State Killer case as an example of what sustained evidence preservation could accomplish. Training programs incorporated the investigation into discussions of cold case methodology. Forensic scientists highlighted the importance of biological evidence. Genealogists studied the investigative process that transformed distant family relationships into a viable investigative lead. Universities examined the case within criminal justice curricula. Investigation had become far more than a solved crime. It became an educational model for future generations. The victims themselves also shaped the legacy of the case. Their willingness to participate in the judicial process after decades of silence demonstrated extraordinary resilience. Many emphasized that they wanted future investigators to understand the lasting impact violent crime has upon survivors. They reminded the public that behind every forensic breakthrough stands a human story measured not in laboratory reports, but in years of interrupted lives. As media coverage gradually shifted away from daily courtroom updates, another realization emerged. The Golden State Killer investigation had fundamentally changed public expectations regarding cold cases. For years, many believed that once enough time passed, certain crimes would remain permanently unsolved. The successful identification and prosecution of Joseph James D'Angelo challenged that assumption. Its preserved evidence no longer represented forgotten history. Instead, it became a continuing opportunity. Every unsolved case containing viable biological evidence suddenly carried renewed hope. The story that began with unexplained burglaries in suburban California during the mid-1970s had reached its legal conclusion. Yet its influence was only beginning. The investigation would soon become one of the defining examples of how persistence, interagency cooperation, and advancing science could reshape criminal justice itself, inspiring investigators around the world to reopen files once considered impossible to solve and proving that even after 40 years, evidence preserved with care can still speak louder than silence. 40 years is long enough for entire neighborhoods to change beyond recognition. Children become parents. Parents become grandparents. Detectives retire. Laboratories replace outdated equipment. And technologies once imagined only in science fiction become standard investigative tools. Yet throughout those 4 decades, one thing remained remarkably constant. The evidence collected from the Golden State Killer crime scenes never changed. It waited silently inside secured evidence rooms while generations of investigators came and went. It neither weakened its memory nor forgot the truth it contained. When the identity of Joseph James D'Angelo was finally confirmed, the investigation became far more than the resolution of one notorious serial crime spree. It became one of the clearest demonstrations in modern criminal justice that careful evidence preservation, combined with scientific innovation and relentless determination, can overcome even the longest passage of time. Following the conclusion of the criminal proceedings, law enforcement agencies across the United States began studying the Golden State Killer investigation in unprecedented detail. Police academies incorporated the case into training programs. Detectives assigned to cold case units examined every phase of the investigation. Crime scene technicians reviewed evidence preservation procedures. Forensic laboratories evaluated how decades-old biological samples had ultimately produced decisive DNA matches. The investigation evolved into a practical blueprint for future cold case work. One lesson appeared repeatedly throughout professional discussions. Evidence must always be collected with the future in mind. The technicians processing crime scenes during the 1970s had no knowledge of forensic genetic genealogy. Many had never heard the term DNA profiling because the technology had not yet entered criminal investigation. Nevertheless, they carefully preserved biological material according to professional standards. They labeled evidence accurately, maintained chain of custody, stored samples appropriately. Those routine procedures, performed without any expectation of future scientific breakthroughs, became the foundation upon which the entire investigation was eventually solved. The case also highlighted the extraordinary importance of interagency cooperation. Originally, different police departments investigated different phases of the offender's crimes. Sacramento detectives pursued the East Area rapist. Southern California agencies investigated the original Night Stalker murders. Earlier investigators examined the Visalia ransacker burglaries. Jurisdictional separation complicated recognition that the same offender connected every investigation. As communication improved and forensic science advanced, those barriers gradually disappeared. The Golden State Killer investigation demonstrated that major serial investigations often demand cooperation extending far beyond individual agencies. Information sharing became one of the defining strengths of the eventual solution. Forensic genetic genealogy also entered a new stage of public awareness because of the case. Before 2018, relatively few people outside specialized investigative circles understood how genealogy could contribute to criminal investigations. After D'Angelo's arrest, the methodology received international attention. Law enforcement agencies began carefully evaluating unsolved cases involving preserved biological evidence. Professional organizations developed guidelines governing responsible investigative use. Legal scholars examined privacy considerations alongside public safety interests. The Golden State Killer investigation, therefore, influenced not only criminal investigation, but also broader conversations concerning law, ethics, and scientific responsibility. Investigators consistently emphasized one essential principle: genealogy generated and investigative led. It did not replace traditional evidence. Once Joseph James D'Angelo became a suspect, detectives followed established investigative procedures: surveillance, collection of discarded biological material, independent forensic DNA comparison, laboratory confirmation. Only after those steps established a scientific match did authorities proceed toward arrest. That careful sequence preserved the integrity of both the investigation and the judicial process. The victims' experiences continued shaping public understanding of the case long after sentencing concluded. Many survivors participated in documentaries, interviews, and educational programs discussing resilience, recovery, and the importance of never abandoning unsolved investigations. Some explained that although the arrest brought relief, healing remained a lifelong process. Others emphasized that simply knowing the offender's identity removed decades of uncertainty. The unknown had finally become known.